Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of May. Today I'm just going to be focusing mainly on the Bakhmut front and what's been going on over the past 4 or 5 days. Sorry for not uploading recently. It's probably going to be this way for another month or so, but then once summer begins, I'm just going to go all out with uploading every single day. So get excited for that. For now, let's talk about what occurred in Bakhmut. And so, if you recall in my last video, I was talking about how the Ukrainians, they were conducting these localized counterattacks along the Donbass Canal, which I'll mark in red over here. Here's where it flows. And so, the Russians, they did have some forward positions across this canal. They did control some of the coal mines, some of the deposits, and some of the forested areas that were just to the west of this canal. But again, because the Russians, they really did not have a lot of men defending this area, they weren't really guarding their flanks effectively. And because the Ukrainians actually did have and still do have a very sizable contingent of men in this area, it's actually called Tactical Group Azov, this entire area that I'm going over in arrows. There's a lot of different assault detachments that have been recently formed that are very steadfast in the defense of Ukraine, like 24th Assault Battalion, which is basically a reconfiguring, basically just a remaking of the IDAR Battalion, if you recall. There's also the 5th Assault Regiment and other such units, and so a lot of these more assault or offensive-oriented units with infantry, this mobile infantry, they have been going on the attack, trying to dislodge the Russians, who were really on a defensive posture in this area because they did not have any sort of offensive capabilities to advance to the north towards Chasiv Yar. And they saw how the Russians were exposed. Their logistics weren't that good in this area, and so they conducted an attack. And the Russians really had no means of defending the positions that they held to the west of the Donbass Canal in this circled area, and so they had to retreat across the canal. And a lot of people were saying that this is something that commonly occurs, which is true. You do have back and forth in this area, but this time it was different because the Ukrainians did not only take over the areas to the west of the canal, but they crossed the canal entirely and began clearing out this forested area. And this forested area has been a gray zone for a very long time. The Russians, they cleared out most of it and were actually very close to taking over all of Ivanivske a few months ago, but gradually the Ukrainians sent in reinforcements to the area and defended it tooth and nail, and gradually they pushed back the Russians as the Russians began to put less of an emphasis on their southern flanks. And now, as of May 14th, which is when this occurred, the Ukrainians cleared out the entire forested area. And what this means is that the Ukrainians are pretty close to the town of Klishivka, which, if you remember, was one of the main defensive nodes for the Ukrainians on the southern flank of Bakhmut that the Russians took over in late January, which gave them very good fortified positions. Over here, a lot of trenches, and it is on higher ground. It also gave them access to different types of minor roads leading into Bakhmut or leading towards Ivanivske, and so in that regard, it is important, as well as also a logistics hub. And so now it is within the range of a lot of Ukrainian fire. And there's also the threat, of course, of Ukraine retaking the town physically, although I don't believe that they will, because now the Russians have been able to retreat and regroup effectively around the town of Klishivka, and it's going to be much more difficult to clear that area out. The Russians, they really didn't fight that much to defend the forested area or the areas to the west of the canal. They just sort of retreated on their own because they saw how there was no use in defending it. But Klishivka is a different story. There's a lot of fortified areas over here that Ukraine built and that Russia has inherited, and they will use that to their defense. They will use it very effectively in that regard. They could set up the trenches again, and of course the town itself is filled with these concrete bunkers. So assaulting Klishivka might be a bridge too far for the Ukrainians, especially given the fact that they still need to defend the city of Bakhmut itself. And so let's go to the northern flank, where over the past week or so, you could say, the Ukrainians have also been conducting some minor localized counterattacks. And so if you recall, the front line before my last video was around here, around Bohdanivka, where the Russians were very, very close to really entering the town from the north, fighting in its northern outskirts. But since then, the Ukrainians have been able to dislodge the Russian fort positions. They also took over this rail station, which was another major Russian fort position. They took over the Russian positions that are just to the north of the T0506 highway, which is one of the roads that is supplying Bakhmut, which then links up with Kromove. And so, again, this relieves a lot of the pressure off of Ukraine's supply lines. It also gives them back control over their trenches that you have here labeled in black. I have some of them mapped out, and so now a lot of those are back under Ukrainian control. And so they will be able to use those again to defend against any sort of potential Russian counterattack. Additionally, the Ukrainian forces in their counterattack, they were able to reach very close to some of the towns that they had lost really many months ago, such as Berkivka and Yahidne. Now, it's going to be very difficult for them to retake these towns because, again, these towns are very close to the city of Bakhmut itself, which is very urban in nature, and you have a lot of troops, whether they be from the Wagner Group or reinforcements that are coming in now from Chechnya, that will be filling up all the holes within the city itself. And so entering the city itself head on by the Ukrainians, even from the north around this Stupka district of Bakhmut, is going to be incredibly difficult, especially as they're still trying to defend the citadel area within western Bakhmut. But then again, the reason why Ukraine did this was to shift the front line a bit more to the east in order to relieve the pressure off of the supply lines. And so in that regard, they've been successful because since the Ukrainians began this operation around May 12th was when they really began expanding the sphere of control to the north of Bodanivka. And then by May 14th, they had like this front line set up. So within those 2 days, they were able to push back the front line, and since then the Russians have not responded in kind to try to retake the previous lines which they had lost, probably because, again, they don't have the necessary manpower to be able to conduct such an offensive operation, and so they just decided to withdraw to the new lines, which are, I guess, sufficient until they meet their objectives within the city of Bakhmut itself. If we go up a bit even more, we could see that the Ukrainians also took back full control of Orikovo-Vasilivka, which is a town that has been contested for multiple months now and really could have been Russia's segue to taking over Minkivka, Holubivka, Privilia, many of these towns that are very close to the Donbass Canal. And then you could cross the canal and potentially flank Chasiv Yar from the north. That was the logic that the Russians were using, and that's why they even pushed towards this chain of towns in the first place. But as Wagner's commitments became more and more focused on the urban battles within Bakhmut, they shifted focus, and the Russians, they had to send in their own reinforcements that are not associated with the Wagner Group, whether it be VDV. I know there's some speculation now that there weren't even VDVs in the first place on the flanks. DPR, LPR fighters, some of them were sent to the flanks. You, of course, had regular motorized infantry regiments that were sent to the flanks. That occurred in my last video. I was talking about how a specific unit within the 3rd Army Corps, which is a volunteer unit that was organized last summer, was seen fighting on the southern flank of Bakhmut. And so all of those units are involved, but not to a great enough extent to defend the current lines, let alone conduct their own offensive operations. And so that's when you see Ukraine taking advantage of these weak points to chip away at Russian positions and set up new defensive lines a bit further to the east. But now, let's get to the main, juiciest part of this video, which will be the city of Bakhmut itself, where we do see Wagner Group continuing to make gains. So let's begin by talking about what happened on May 12th. May 12th, the Wagner Group, they were able to fully secure the Olympic School, which was heavily fought over for really like a week and a half, you could say. A very small area, but nonetheless, Ukrainians put up a very prolonged defense of this area. But once the Olympic School fell, it sort of had this domino effect where the Wagner Group was able to gain momentum and take over other larger facilities in the northern parts of this northwestern corner, and so they were able to fully take over that set of roads, and at the same time they continued to push in the northwestern corner in general and take over all of these residential blocks, these one-story houses with a plot of land as a garden, and then of course like the trees in between and all of these roads. So it's a less dense part of Bakhmut, as I've said before. And so as a result of all this pressure from the Wagner Group, as they begin to clear out a lot of these less urban, more spread out parts of the city, the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw to their last defensive line within the northwestern corner, which is this garage line, which is what I call it, because basically from this road over here, Voyniv International Street, whatever, from this northern street to the southern street over here, Deka Bristov streets, you have this chain of garages that are running, and they're pretty much connected all the way from north to south, that could be used to set up these good firing positions, these good fortifications to protract the defense of the northwestern corner for as long as possible. And so this is protecting the flanks of the citadel, which exists just to the south, and it's protecting the Ukrainian control over some key road junctions leading into Bakhmut in the first place. And so that's where the fighting is going on now. The Wagner Group trying to take over this one last defensive line of the Ukrainians. Now, within the citadel itself, this is interesting. So on May 12th, this is when Wagner finally infiltrated the citadel itself. Let's circle the citadel, or to be more accurate, this looks more like a truncated cone. And so the Russians, they gained a foothold pushing through the northern area. They pushed through this street called Levanevskoho Street. Probably not saying that correctly, but nonetheless, this is where they conducted their initial push, and they took over some of the northernmost apartment buildings and stores within the citadel. So over here, and then from there they conducted further more piercing attacks, is what I'd call them, that would pierce the Ukrainian front line in one specific point. In this case, that specific point is Lenevskogo Streets, whatever, this street over here. And then they consolidate their gains by taking over some adjacent apartment buildings, taking over the supermarket, the Blooming City store, this cafe. And by doing this, they were able to split up the Ukrainian garrisons within the citadel into two. One part of the garrison was mainly centered around this school, and still is, by the way. And then the other part of the garrison stationed around these dense apartment complexes that are further to the east. And so at the same time as the Russians were piercing through the center of the citadel, they also began launching these attacks on the east and began gaining a foothold over there. And I'm sure that was extremely costly, by the way. But again, it just put the right amount of pressure on a specific area where Ukraine probably did have a disadvantage in manpower just because they were so isolated. And so it was at that point that the Ukrainians made the decision to withdraw before they would be totally isolated in this eastern pocket. And so this area that I'm going over here, you can see this is what was left of the Ukrainian resistance in the eastern part of the citadel, but they withdrew, and now the Russians are clearing it out. And so it's not fully under Wagner control. Wagner is like still clearing out this movie theater over here, but more or less the current front line in this area between Russia and Ukraine is the Vulitsia Uvilena streets. And so if you cross that street, there are still some important facilities for Ukraine to utilize to continue defending the, not really the citadel anymore, but still parts of Bakhmut more on the outskirts. So you have here like a minor government building, you have a car wash, you have some industrial facilities that are a bit smaller, and you do have admittedly some apartments over here that are located on the outskirts, on the periphery of the city. So Ukraine does still have those positions, but they lost the main complexes the main defensive nodes, the main firing positions for snipers and machine guns that they were using before to hold back the Russians. So it's going to be easier for Russia to now take over the remaining pockets of resistance than it was to infiltrate the truncated cone, as I called it before, which they did starting a few days ago. And at the same time, the Ukrainians, they do still have control over the western part of the citadel. In the western part of the citadel, you have this important school with the soccer field, basketball court. It is a good area to set up defensive positions. And then all around it, you have different structures, high-rise buildings that will be used to defend against the Russian invasion and the Russian assaults in this area. So this area is what I'm specifically referring to. But then if you go a bit to the west, there's also the Bakhmut Children's Hospital, which serves as sort of a building which connects the citadel to the Ukrainian defense of the garage line. So it is important that Ukraine continue to hold on to it in order to maintain continuity between the northern and southern parts of the Ukrainian defensive line. And so, yeah, that's the situation in Bakhmut. If I were to summarize it, I would say that Wagner, they're concentrating their final efforts at taking the city, specifically on clearing out the last remaining Ukrainian strongholds. They're not aiming at an encirclement at the moment. If they were, we would see assaults on the flanks. Not even like the wider flanks, like Ivanivske, which could be difficult because of the huge amount of Ukrainian units that are defending that area. Not even on like Bodanivka, for instance, where again it is very far away from Russia's main lines, their main supply lines, their main center of infantry, their main staging grounds, which are within the city of Bakhmut itself. But also like even a localized encirclement we're not seeing being manifested. If you were to see a localized encirclement, it would sort of entail taking over Kromove and advancing through or past Tchaikovskaya Street and just encircling the remaining Ukrainian lands in Bakhmut, which amount to about 1.89 square kilometers according to Prigozhin, which would be about 3% of the city that's still under Ukrainian hands. According to Prigozhin, the Russians, they gained today 220 meters of land. Not much, but within the context of this urban fighting, every single square meter is probably significant, especially if it's including some high-rise apartment building, which it is according to Prigozhin. Prigozhin says that out of the 48 high-rises within this citadel area, the Wagner Group has control of 36 of them, which means there's 12 left under Ukrainian control. And I'm sure that just based on the map, you can see this for yourself, that some of the larger structures are under Wagner control. There are still some here that I'm going to zoom in on that are under Ukrainian control, but a lot of the larger ones are under Russian control. And so that will give them new positions to fire upon the Ukrainians. And we know that this is true because the Ukrainians have responded by firing their own artillery. You have the 67th Mechanized Brigade and the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade that posted their own videos showing how they were targeting Russian machine gun positions that were recently set up after the taking of one such apartment building, which shows that, first of all, Ukraine does still have access to artillery in this area, and second, that they are utilizing it specifically to eliminate the Wagner Group as they are taking over positions within the citadel. And this is a pretty good idea because a lot of Wagner Group's men, they're going to be concentrated in one specific area, like an apartment or like some alleyway or some streets, and the artillery is going to be much more effective when they're all concentrated in one specific area. So you could see some higher casualties as a result. You're also seeing a lot of Ukrainian artillery fire into the Russian positions in the northwestern corner because you see a very concentrated Russian advance in this direction with a lot of men. And that is part of the reason why Wagner Group has suffered more casualties in recent weeks compared to beforehand. And another takeaway from this is the fact that Ukraine will probably be able to withdraw its men without an encirclement, as I said before, because if you look at the supply lines are now protected. The T-0506 highway is now at its best state that it was in like really months, because for the past few months the Russians have been steadily advancing, taking over different tree lines, taking over different trenches to the north of the road, and they were actively shelling it, firing mortars and stuff. And so now they can still do that, obviously, because they're still very close to the road, but to a much lower extent. They can't really use small arms fire anymore, which they were doing before because the Russians had taken over some of the trench lines to the north of the T-0506 highway. But now Ukraine will be able to use it much more freely than they were before. They will need to reconstruct some of the destroyed bridges in this area. Like there's one bridge over here that's destroyed, but they could use a pontoon bridge probably or a makeshift bridge, whatever the sappers have, to fix that problem. But they also can alleviate it by going through a more minor route into Kromove. Also, in Ivanivske, there's another route that I have marked over here that can be used to enter Bakhmut. So like you go from the T-0504 highway and then make your way through this minor dirt path into the northwestern corner of Bakhmut. And you could also go into the citadel by going to the right. And so, yeah, that is the situation as of May 15th in Bakhmut. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.